Kia ora, everyone, all the attendees. Thank you so much for joining us. And as everybody is joining in and attending the session, I will quickly go through a small introduction on how we're going to go over this webinar and give you a little bit of an introduction on how we can use chat boxes and Q&A. Welcome and thank you for joining us. And just as a disclaimer, this webinar is being recorded and it is being live streamed on our Facebook and YouTube channels. So after this, if anybody needs to go share our webinar and watch it live again, please please do so on our Facebook and YouTube channels. I'm Aisha Asif, the ECO's Exec Officer, and I am just here as your host with ECO. And I would like to first request you to use the chat box to introduce yourself and let us know what organization you are representing. And please use the Q&A box to input any of your any questions so that the speakers can answer them live. This webinar is formatted to run from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. and we will break at 6 p.m. for a 10 to 15 minute break. And during this time, we will use it for questions to be answered by our speakers. However, if you feel like you need to stretch your legs and walk about, take a break, please feel free to use this time for that. I will now hand over to Barry to take us forward.
Haere mai, kia ora tātou, Barry Weeber aho, Mari ora oho, Mari tu, Mari ora, kia tātou, hu mai e, hui e, tā kie. Kia ora tātou, welcome everyone to this eco webinar on the use of ecocide. And I'm going to be the chair of the meeting. I'm the co-chairperson of ECO, and we've got two great speakers talking tonight about the issue about ecocide. Lyndon DeVantier and is going to start the conversation, and Brigid is going to run through, so they're going to swap between the two speakers, between the different sessions. And as Aisha suggested, if you've got any questions as we go through, put them in the chat, and we'll see what we can answer them initially in the break period. Then afterwards, we'll have a session for about half an hour with questions, or a bit more than half an hour on questions. I don't know, if, Lyndon, you might want to introduce yourselves, and Cath Wallace, who's the co-vice chair, is going to help with the question and answers, as well as Aisha. I'm just trying to think whether there's anything else I need to say at this stage in terms of the process, but I will introduce Lyndon first to start with the topic, because it's a bit of a, there's lots of issues and there's lots of information, and the best thing to do is start. Thanks, Lyndon.
Thank you, Barry. Tira koutou katoa. Yes, my name is Lyndon DeVantier. My background is in coral reefs, coral ecology, so I got a fairly early indication that we need to come around to stop our unsustainable practices on Earth here. So that's how I got involved in the Stop Ecocide campaign, and I think we can proceed with the slides. If Aisha can put them up on the screen, we'll kick off, because we've got a lot to get through. So we'll make some progress here.
Thanks, Lyndon.
Now.
Oh, Brigid, do you want to introduce while Aisha gets the slides?
I'll introduce when I take over the slides. So go ahead, Lyndon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, so today we're going to get through a fair bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem, which, if Aisha shows us the second slide, which I'm sure that this audience is really well aware of, so that will be fairly quickly dealt with. We'll talk about some of the solutions that are being applied to greater or lesser success. Then I'll hand over to Brigid, who is going to talk about the Ecocide campaign in a lot more detail, and I think that's where many people will be really quite interested, because it's making some significant progress at the moment. So that is the main core of this, and then we'll have a little bit about the examples later. That will be after our 6 o'clock break. And then we'll put it into our local context as best we can. And if there's time, we'll talk about some of the other legal mechanisms like the Earth Laws approach. So thanks, Aisha. So the problem, this is a quote from the UN, that, biodiversity lost at a rate not seen since the last mass extinction, with predicted loss of 1 million species in coming decades. We're in ecological overshoot. There's no question about that amongst the science community and anyone who looks out their window, really. We're exceeding planetary boundaries in a whole range of crucial cycles at the present time, and that's predicted to get worse, with obvious serious flow-on consequences for not just the biosphere, but for us as members of it. So yeah, you'll see on these slides, and they'll be available to people throughout and later, that there are the links are all here, so people can actually go back and trace this stuff up if they wish to. Thank you, Aisha. Did we jump a couple there? Sorry, sure. Yeah, so one more. Yes, well, that's it. So New Zealand is not, Aotearoa is not exempt from the issues that the world faces. We have a dreadful record here, and it stretches back in time, but it's stretching forward into really dire consequences for our nation, let alone the rest of the planet. I don't think I need to read through the stats. They're alarming, to say the least. And just the one point that I would make for the marine mammals, we've only got 26% of them considered threatened or at risk of being threatened. However, 10 of those species are data deficient. We honestly do not know. The people that have been studying them, and we've got some of the world experts on these cetaceans in particular, here in New Zealand, and the species are still considered to be data deficient. So the situation is quite grim. Thank you. So just to put it in a perspective of an author that I consider to be really quite lyrical, Richard Powers. Many of you may have already read this book, but if not, I think this quote sums it up beautifully. Now she sees a forest spreading across these mountains since before humans left Africa, giving way to second homes. She sees in one great glimpse of flashing gold, trees and humans at war over land and water and atmosphere. And she can hear, louder than the quaking leaves, which side will lose by winning. Thanks, Aisha. Powers continues, that's the trouble with people, their root problem. Life runs alongside them unseen, right here, right next, creating the soil, cycling water, trading in nutrients, making weather, building atmosphere, feeding and curing and sheltering more kinds of creatures than people know how to count. A chorus of living wood sings to the woman, if your mind were only a slightly greener thing, we would drown you in meaning. Thanks, Aisha. Of course, it's not just Jeff Powers. People have been warning us of this for many, many decades. And I'm sure most, if not all of you, have already read Jeff Park's wonderful book. But if not, I cannot recommend it highly enough. And this was written back in 1995. So we're a long way past that now. But Jeff at the time said, New Zealand's fertile plains were the last that Europeans found before Earth's supply revealed itself as finite. Our relationship with them has been completely unsustainable, exploited with all the violence that modern science and technology could summon. The vital part that Maori played will have to become central once again to their care. Indigenous knowledge is crucial. So the issues really are about intergenerational inequity for both us and the biosphere. Earth's biosphere has immense intrinsic value beyond human accounting. That's a big part of our problem. People don't understand that importantly enough. It also provides essential services for current and future generations, including climate regulation, carbon sequestration, clean air and water, cultural amenity, energy, disease and pest control, fire regulation, food, habitat provisioning, medicine, land stabilisation, mitigation of natural disasters, pollinisation, resistance to high winds and seed dispersal. The list is endless, really. And, you know, I think ecologists and others that have been grappling with ways to actually bring this thinking into the mainstream. Costanza, in particular, early on coined the term ecological services or ecosystem services to try to get people to understand how important our biosphere is to it. So there have been many international measures to protect biodiversity and humanity. How have we been doing? So this is quite recent out of Nature magazine. The UN's decade-old plan to slow or stop the decline of species and ecosystems by 2020 has failed. It doesn't get much clearer than that. Most of the plan's 20 targets, the HE biodiversity targets, part of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, have not been met. So we set new targets. New targets are expected to be negotiated and agreed this year. So it's not working at the moment. Thanks, Aisha. So are treaties and targets enough? I don't think so myself, given that decades of treaties have not reduced ecological impacts. And this frontier extractivist paradigm continues to dominate. We clearly need a legally enforceable international process to protect the natural world from us, or at least from some of us. Making ecocide a crime could be one such tool, but none of us that are involved with this think it'll be a panacea. We have a long way to go. Thank you. Thanks, Aisha. So just to give you a bit of sense of where this has come from, the actual word ecocide, as far as we know, was coined back in 1970 by an American ecologist, Arthur Galston, and he used it to describe what the US military was doing in Vietnam. And he, at the time, proposed that there should be an international agreement to ban it. That was followed up quite soon afterwards in 1972 by Olof Palme and the Swedish Prime Minister, and it has been raised subsequently at various times. Thanks, Aisha. So jumping forward to the mid-1990s with the Rome Statute, ecocide was actually considered inclusion in early drafts, along with the others that had come down from the Nuremberg trials. Unfortunately, ecocide was withdrawn from the draft statute after 3 nations, the UK, France and the Netherlands, pressed for its removal. So the reasons behind that are uncertain, but we probably all have our own thoughts on it. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Brigid. So Brigid can then take us through for the next section. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Lyndon. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko kawarau te moka, ko wakatipu wai Māori te roto, ko tahuna te papakaika, ko kotirani ni airani na iwi, ko huria te tangata, ko Brigid Inder e mihine. We put in this beautiful tui. It's a beautiful piece of public artwork by a local Wellington artist called Gina Keel. And it seemed appropriate to have a tui with its symbolism in Te Ao Māori, both for communication, but also of harmony, and amongst other associations. And given ecocide is a strategy we hope will address both the climate and ecological crises we face by supporting humanity to transition from a relationship of harm to a relationship of harmony. I should say that unlike most of you on this Zoom call, I don't come to this issue as an ecologist or scientist or an environmental expert or activist. I've come to this from my work with the International Criminal Court and in the international justice sector for almost 15 years, including in my work as a special advisor to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. I'm also coming to this based on my peace building work with communities most affected by armed conflicts in East, Central and North Africa. So I just want to begin by saying I've seen firsthand the impact of conflicts on the environment. The permanent loss of land for food production, the loss of trees for shelter, birds, animals, and food, a reduction of diverse forests that are destroyed by the use of military weapons or cut down to flush out militia groups from their camps in the bush. In a few of the conflicts I worked in, trading in wild animals and large-scale mining were operations that funded the military activities of a large number of militia groups. So conflict may seem like an extreme example to start with, and it's not even our worst source of environmental damage. But what I want to say is that our inclination towards conflict with each other mirrors the conflict we are collectively having with the earth. And it's as if we are waging war against nature that is both brazen and stealth-like at the same time. I'm also approaching this based on my work in peacemaking and mediation, having seen the violence ordinary people are capable of when they are disconnected from themselves and their communities. Disconnection is the breeding ground for conflict. It has a numbing effect, whether towards people or the natural environment, because it allows us to make decisions without considering the consequences and impact of those decisions on current and future generations and for the more than human forms of life. So our hope is that the crime of ecocide provides the space for more people to move from a place of disconnection to a place of deep care. We think it's a unifying idea. We see it as a potential circuit breaker in the cycle of harm, and it could be a catalyst for enormous change. I wanted to put those ideas up front before we get into the density of the legal definition, because we can sometimes lose focus of some of the deeper ethical issues at play here. So thanks, Aisha. I could go to the next slide and the next one after that. So the aim of this campaign is both very ambitious, but also very discreet. The Stop Ecocide campaign wants to amend the treaty of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court to include ecocide as the fifth crime, or the missing crime, the fifth crime against peace, alongside war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. All of the existing crimes are all focused, if you could just go back, all of the existing crimes are all focused on the protection of humans. The environment is not yet protected by international criminal law, and we are seeing the repercussions of that gap now in the form of climate change, reduced biodiversity, marine pollution, and the loss of ecosystems. The rationale behind this campaign is if we're going to use criminal justice at the international level to protect people and to stop mass killings and other crimes, shouldn't we also use it to stop people causing mass damage to the environment? The next slide, thank you. There are two guiding principles, I think, behind this campaign. The first is the idea of doing no harm as a foundational guiding principle. The second is recognizing that we have an ethical duty of care for the environment. Some may call it a law of obligations. In Te Ao Māori, it's the concept of kaitiakitanga, or stewardship or guardianship of the environment. Both of these principles of do no harm and the ethical duty of care really compel us to consider our decisions, bearing in mind their impact on the balance of life, our relationship with the natural world, with ecosystems and other species, as well as the consequences of these decisions for current and future generations, several generations in front of us, including those not yet born for whom we are their ancestors. The question at this stage is, are we being good ancestors? Ecocide sits at the complicated and complex intersection of Indigenous worldviews and knowledge, international criminal law, politics, environmental advocacy, and nature-based connections. The concept of duty of care is really all about our relationship and our connection with the natural world. And the ethical duty of care concept is really an invitation and a responsibility for us to get better at living within parameters in which life-sustaining ecosystems can also thrive. In 2020, there was two students completed a thesis on ecocide with respect to New Zealand legislation and Māori culture. And in the process of that, they interviewed Māori leaders, philosophers, scientists, and advocates, a relatively small number, but they were key informants in their thesis. And those interviewed felt that an international law on ecocide may complement and align with Te Ao Māori regarding principles such as kaitiakitanga, tapu, and the restoration of balance. Those interviewed also felt that it may assist in preventing destruction of natural resources affecting iwi and hapu. As we all know, there is a spectrum of harm playing out, and people in different parts of the world are experiencing more or less of the symptoms of climate change and ecological crisis depending on where they live. Indigenous nations and communities are often the people most affected by environmental damage, loss of biodiversity, as well as rising sea levels and devastating storms and floods. The UN has recognized that climate change poses a threat to the survival of Indigenous communities worldwide, even though it is acknowledged that Indigenous peoples contribute the least to greenhouse gas emissions. One of the recommendations of that thesis is what I've asterisked there, which is the need for more conversations going forward. And the campaign, the Stop Ecocide Aotearoa campaign, plans to indeed have, of course, more conversations with iwi advocates and activists. And we're also interested in exploring ecocide as it relates to te tiriti obligations, and whether this could be an additional lever to perhaps advance and address those obligations in the environmental space. Before leaving this slide, I want to acknowledge the incredible work of Mike Smith, who is leading the work on climate change for the iwi Cheers Forum, who submitted a dossier to the ICC, I think in 2019, regarding the oil drilling activities by OMV, an Austrian oil giant, off the coast of Taranaki. Okay, we could go to the next slide. Thank you. Why focus on the ICC? Why focus on an international law? Well, we think there are at least 4 reasons. The first is for coherence. If an international law is adopted, it then becomes a universal standard. It becomes the benchmark for domestic legislation of ratifying countries, and thus creating coherence across jurisdictions. An international law provides consistency and transparency in defining the crime. It expands accountability, and it introduces accountability for acts not yet criminalized. And importantly, it elevates damage and destruction of the environment to a crime for which there is no justification. The law has a powerful normalizing effect, and an ecocide law would create the prohibition of ecocide as an absolute norm, on par with, for example, the crime of genocide. So this status also means, in addition to the international standards, it also means that if adopted, any state party to the ICC could prosecute individuals, whether a citizen of their own country or not, whose actions may meet the threshold of ecocide if those acts are occurring within the territory of a state's party. Ecocide, we think, should be considered an umbrella law like genocide, a law that can't be written around. In other words, there is an international law prohibiting genocide that states can't write domestic laws to get around it. They can't write laws to allow genocide in any form. The second reason that we think it's very strategic to pursue an international law on ecocide is a sense of solidarity and kind of safety in numbers. An international law would give governments a sense of safety in numbers and limit the ability of corporations to move their operations to other jurisdictions in order to avoid the law. It may help create the enabling conditions, making it easier for everyone to do the right thing. For example, it probably becomes easier for environment ministers or other ministers to refuse a license for deforestation, fossil fuel extraction, or conventional mining if there is an international law preventing this. The next slide, thanks Aisha. The third point is I've already mentioned really, is transboundary jurisdiction. The biggest polluters are all multinationals or state entities. So an international law would capture and limit the jurisdictions in which they can operate. The last one is mobilizing force. And what I mean by this is that the ICC provides a common focus for 123 states who are very involved and invested in this institution. So engaging a large number of countries around a debate and negotiation on ecocide could have a tremendous effect in mobilizing governments in every region simultaneously en masse, and harnessing the machinery of ministries, of ministers, of subcommittees, and of course civil society in readiness for the introduction of ecocide as a prosecutable crime, both through the international law as well as ratifying that law domestically. For that to happen, if we can just stay with that slide, for that to happen in 123 countries simultaneously is really a potential game changer. This could help take humanity on a whole new path. Before leaving this, I just want to also say that some see the ICC as perhaps needing an injection of new energy and positivity and goodwill. So collaborating on a crime of ecocide could be just the kind of inspiration that multilateralism needs right now. The next slide talks about some states that already have or are considering national legislation. There are at least 11 states that currently have ecocide laws, mostly Russia and states of the former Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Georgia, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan. Their laws closely mirror each other, and they focus on addressing mass destruction, contamination, and acts which cause or are capable of causing ecological catastrophe. Vietnam also has a law on ecocide, and of course it has its own unique history of environmental damage during its war of the 1970s. Scholars, including Richard Falk, who was a supporter of the Stop Ecocide campaign and is a former UN Special Rapporteur and Professor of International Law and Practice at Princeton University, he has described the Vietnam War as the first modern instance in which the environment itself was selected as a military target. Not surprisingly, Vietnam's law frames ecocide as a crime against humanity regarding destruction of the natural environment, whether in times of peace or war. Lastly, France introduced its law rather quickly last year, some might say too quickly. It focuses on endangering the environment and intentional pollution of water, air or soil. In December of last year, the Belgian government voted to support the International Ecocide Amendment before the ICC and to include ecocide in the Belgian Penal Code. This is a really quick slide just showing the different sort of hierarchy of law, the soft law Paris Agreement level in which it's aspirational, there are commitments made, these are global agreements, but soft law lacks the teeth to ensure implementation and accountability. Beyond peer pressure between states, there really isn't more that can be done. The civil law, of course, at the national level and and criminal law, both national and international, provides and protections for society, and it allows for universal jurisdiction. The next slide, thank you. We just wanted to briefly introduce this campaign. In 2017, the global campaign was launched by Polly Higgins and Jojo Mehta to introduce ecocide as an international crime. Polly was a Scottish barrister who had been working on these issues for many years prior to the launch of the global campaign. In fact, she dedicated the last decade of her life solely to this issue. Polly passed away in 2019 at the age of 50, but Jojo admirably continues to lead the campaign with a wonderful team of Stop Ecocide staff, board and advisors. And if we go to the next slide, I just love this quote from Polly, who often would reference the power of this one simple law to protect the earth. We started a branch of the campaign here in Aotearoa last year, in 2021. There are now 19 branches and associate groups around the world, and these continue to spring up. Most recently, the Stop Ecocide branches have been launched in Zambia and Kenya. There are a number of international associate groups, as well as interest groups, including Artists for Ecocide, Lawyers for Ecocide, and a new group established in part because of conversations we have been having here and with the international office about engaging the farming community on these issues. So they have now launched an interest group created for those working in or working on farming and on the agricultural sector. There's also a group of global leaders and public figures supporting it, MPs, former politicians, scientists, influencers, journalists, artists, academics, faith leaders, people like Jane Goodall, Pope Francis, Greta Thunberg, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, Paul McCartney, the former head of state of Finland, Tarja Halonen, His Royal Highness Al Hassan bin Talal, a well-regarded senior royal from the Kingdom of Jordan. This is significant because Jordan is one of only 2 ICC states parties from the Middle East region, and they are a very active member amongst ICC states parties. There are also, of course, a number of respected environmentalists and well-known environmentalists like David Suzuki, Vandana Shiva Anagaya, and many, many others. From our own region, from the Pacific region, there are 2 public supporters, the Prime Minister of Samoa, the Right Honourable Fiami Naomi Mataafa, and Samoan former judge of the ICC, Judge Tuiloma Neroni Slade. In a relatively short period of time, the campaign has gained significant momentum. I think because there's a sense of the urgency of the climate and ecological crisis, and also because there's a sense that this is an idea whose time has come. And many people are moving into a place of deeper care and connection with the environment, and others, I think, are beginning to register the seriousness of our current trajectory should we continue to act outside of livable parameters. Thanks, Aisha. That's a good slide to stay on for a moment. I just want to draw your attention to this wonderful quote from Winona LaDuke. Let us be the ancestors our descendants will thank. Winona is a Native American woman of the Ojibwe Nation of Minnesota. She's an environmentalist, economist, writer, and she's well known for her work on tribal land claims. We could go to the next slide, thanks. So in 2020, the campaign commissioned an independent panel of legal experts to try to develop a legal definition of ecocide. What should this look like and sound like? The panel was comprised of international jurists and lawyers, former judges of the ICC, QCs, prosecutors from international and national courts. They began their work in January of last year, and on the 22nd of June, 2021, they launched the draft legal definition of ecocide. And this was a really important milestone and key moment for the campaign. And we have seen a significant escalation in engagement and seriousness and attention to the campaign since the draft legal definition is launched. This slide is basically from the panel of experts, and it's simply indicating the other changes that would need to be made to the Rome Statute should an amendment of ecocide be introduced. It's more housekeeping, really, and tidying up other parts of the statute to reflect the introduction of a new crime. So let's go to now the legal definition of ecocide. This is it. For the purpose of this statute, meaning the Rome Statute, ecocide means unlawful or unwanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Let's unpack that a little bit, because if we could go back, and let's unpack that definition a little bit. I just want to leave it there for you to be able to see and absorb. The panel very cleverly and very clearly utilized existing international legal principles, precedents, and jurisprudence, as well as language and formulations that are already familiar and have already been negotiated. So almost every single word has an existing legal origin. What's different is that the new crime of ecocide would develop the existing law by extending the protection of the environment by international criminal law, and by ensuring it applies beyond times of armed conflict to times of peace. There are a number of aspects of the proposed definition that are drawn from existing provisions. For example, use of the terms severe, widespread, and long-term to describe the prohibited damage are already established within the crimes against humanity, are already established within war crimes within the Rome Statute. Before we move on, I want to just draw out a couple of things. The panel decided not to list potential acts of ecocide, but rather to focus on the level of harm. They felt that the risk with the list is inevitably you will leave important things out. Also that acts not yet envisaged may emerge and sneak in between the gaps if there is a list of defined acts of ecocide. And also by listing acts, it can be a lightning rod for particular sectors to mobilize against support and to undermine support for an international crime of ecocide. So the panel decided to focus on the level of harm and leave the specific examples of what constitutes ecocide up to the prosecutor and ultimately to the judges of the ICC to determine. I want to just stay with this slide, and I've underlined two pieces there, which are important thresholds. First, there must exist a substantial likelihood that the conduct, which can include acts or omissions, will create severe and either widespread or long-term damage. So the test is substantial likelihood. The panel decided not to use cause, meaning that the acts cause severe and either widespread, because they felt that would be too high a bar to meet. So they went with the threshold of substantial likelihood. Now, some may feel that that's overly inclusive of acts that are legal and are socially beneficial and responsibly operated. So they added a second test because ecocide isn't intended to capture everything, and it's not intended to capture acts that are legal, that have social benefits and are responsibly operated. So they added a second threshold, and that's unlawful or wanton acts. This requires proof that the acts are either unlawful or wanton, and this additional threshold draws upon existing environmental law principles which balance social and economic benefits with environmental harms through the concept of sustainable development. So with these two thresholds, the prosecution would need to prove a substantial likelihood of causing severe and either widespread or long-term damage through acts or omissions that are either unlawful or wanton. Let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Aisha. Act of endangerment. Before we go through the definition in a bit more detail, it's important to note that the legal definition of ecocide has been crafted as an act of endangerment rather than requiring actual or materialized harm. So it attaches to the creation of a dangerous situation rather than a particular outcome. It is the commission of acts with the knowledge of substantial likelihood that they will cause severe and either widespread or long-term harm that is criminalized. It's thus formulated without requiring material result of harm. A substantial risk of damage is sufficient. This is also the case with the crime of genocide in the Rome Statute. There's no requirement that the protected group needs to be actually destroyed in whole or in part, which is one of the requirements of genocide. The crime consists in carrying out actions intended to reach that goal. That goal doesn't need to materialize in order for the actions to be criminal. Okay, we'll go through some of the details a little bit more. I'm not going to define unlawful because that's kind of clear. It's unlawful under national law and regulated at the national level, but wanton is a bit more tricky. This is more complicated and it refers, they've defined it as referring to reckless disregard for damage, which would be clearly excessive in relation to the social and economic benefits anticipated. So this considers the proportionality of the activities and their impact with the intended, and their impact, the activities with their impact in relation to the intended goal. This concept already exists within the Rome Statute framework, this issue of proportionality of impact relative to the intended goal of the activities. So activities may be legal, but they may have a disproportionately negative and damaging effect on the environment. And that may therefore be captured under the definition of ecocide. Severe means damage, as defined by the legal experts, means damage which involves very serious adverse changes, disruption or harm to any element of the environment, including grave impacts on human life or natural, cultural or economic resources. This is the severe aspect. Severe is already a term within the Rome Statute of the ICC. Could you just go back, Aisha, sorry? And this one's important because it's drawing in and acknowledging more than human forms of life and more than, and also indigenous and cultural activities and relationships with nature that are important and compromised by the ongoing climate crisis and ecological crisis. If we go to the next one, the requirement of widespread means damage which extends beyond a limited geographic area, crosses state boundaries, or is suffered by an entire ecosystem or species or a large number of human beings. This concept of widespread and definition was borrowed by from already within the Rome Statute, but it adapted and extended to not just human beings, but ecosystems or species. So it's moving away from a wholly anthropocentric view of international criminal law and the experience of harm. Okay, long term, the panel proposed irreversible damage. It means damage which is irreversible or which cannot be redressed through natural recovery and within a reasonable period of time. This standard does not require waiting for a reasonable period of time to elapse before a prosecution could be brought. Remember, we don't need all the harm to have materialized in order to investigate and prosecute. What constitutes a reasonable period of harm will depend on the particular circumstances and the particular harm created. So for example, would a season be too short to expect the repair of and the natural recovery of whatever harm has occurred? Would a decade be too long? So a reasonable period of time with respect to long-term will be open to interpretation by the prosecution initially and then ultimately by the judges of the ICC. Lastly, the panel decided to define the environment. This has proved previously to be challenging for international law, and until this time there was no single, and there is still no single agreed definition of the term environment. One approach they considered was to leave the term environment undefined, and the benefit of that is that it would, as human understanding of the environment changes, the evolution of knowledge could be taken into account for the purposes of this crime. But bearing in mind we're talking about a court, an international criminal court, the panel decided to adopt a different approach and decided to offer and provide a definition drawing on existing environmental law. So for the purposes of Ecocide, the environment is defined as encompassing the Earth, its biosphere, cryosphere, lithosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere, as well as outer space. And this definition draws upon scientific recognition of the interactions. Okay, what does it mean for industry and businesses? We could go right ahead to the next slide. The Ecocide law is really seen, is in part seen as both accountable, providing accountability, but also as a potential deterrent. It is not retrospective, but we see it as being a red line, a course correction to steer humanity on a more viable and sustainable path. Those leading sustainability in the corporate world, we hope, will welcome the introduction of an Ecocide law. And this could create parameters for business practices and potentially level the playing field amongst those who are already doing the right thing, amongst those who want to do the right thing, and those owners who want to continue their environmentally damaging operations. It can be difficult for businesses to change practices if they feel they may be economically or financially disadvantaged by adopting new, perhaps more expensive, environmentally sustainable methods. The law of Ecocide could be an equalizer for the private sector, making it easier for everyone to do everything that's needed. We know, of course, that the crime of Ecocide on its own won't solve climate change or the ecological crisis. There is now no single action that will do that, but a crime of Ecocide could assist in curbing the worst practices that are having a disproportionate effect on climate change and ecosystem collapse. And it could do that by holding those responsible for those actions accountable. The ICC always focuses on individuals. It doesn't prosecute groups or countries or corporations. So its approach to date has largely been focused on individuals who are considered the most responsible for the worst crimes. In other cases, indictees have been heads of state, senior ministers, militia leaders, political leaders of militia groups. So with respect to Ecocide, that could include heads of corporations, senior leaders in the private sector, heads of banks, heads of state, of course, or ministers associated with the government, heads of or directors in insurance companies who may be insuring activities which fall within the definition of Ecocide. Insurance companies don't fund or insure activities that are associated with genocide. So they would also be potentially liable if they were to be continuing to insure activities that may rise to the level of Ecocide. In other words, the court would pursue individuals whose decisions and actions the court deems responsible for endangering the environment as described by the draft definition. This, of course, creates risks for the private sector at an international legal level it hasn't faced before regarding potential prosecutions. It could suffer reputational and brand damage, loss of shareholder support, loss of confidence, loss of investors, and of course, senior leaders may be convicted of the crime of Ecocide. Okay, if we go to the next slide. There are 3 triggers for the ICC to exercise its jurisdiction. The first is a referral from any state party, and that has, states parties have exercised that trigger a significant number of times in the situations currently under investigation by the ICC. It can also be triggered by a referral from the UN Security Council, or the ICC has the power to open his or herself to open an investigation based on jurisdictional tests, evidence, and judicial approval. I've added Article 15 there of the Rome Statute because I think it might be interesting for ECO members. The prosecutor can receive or request information related to an actual or potential investigation from states parties, from the UN, and from civil society. So this is a possibility where civil society and other actors can submit dossiers to the ICC, providing information, leads, potential evidence, requesting the court to open a preliminary investigation or to undertake preliminary analysis of this information to see if it could rise to the level of a crime within the jurisdiction of the court. This has been used by civil society organizations around the world. And this is a real option, I think, in terms of the expertise within the environmental movement to be providing technical data and analysis to the ICC, Office of the Prosecutor, and urging them to open an investigation. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this outlines a simple 4-stage process. In fact, each of these steps is incredibly complicated and complex, but it is a 4-stage process, so it's helpful to go through this, I think. Firstly, any of the 123 current ICC states parties may propose the introduction or the consideration of the introduction of a new crime. Admissibility for that consideration requires a majority at the ASP to agree that the amendment be considered. At the adoption of the crime level, it requires a 2/3 majority, so that would be 82 states parties in voting in favour of adopting the new crime. And finally, states parties can then ratify this crime within their own jurisdiction and enforce 1 year later. I want to just give you a quick example of the crime of aggression to see how this plays out. And also to say that we're in a better shape than the crime of aggression was. So the crime of aggression was one of the 4 crimes originally listed in the Rome Statute, which was adopted in 1998. However, completion of the definition and the provisions of its jurisdiction were postponed for a later date. Intense and regular negotiations on the crime of aggression were held from 1998 until 2010, when the ICC member states adopted the definition and the conditions of activation of this new crime. Those conditions included ratifications by 30 states by, I think, the 1st of December 2017. This was achieved. So at the Assembly of States Parties meeting, which is the annual meeting of all states parties of the ICC, at their meeting in 2017, they adopted the resolution on the crime of aggression, thus activating it as international law, effective as of the 17th of July 2018. So in effect, this took 20 years. Now we all agree we don't have 20 years to introduce the crime of ecocide, but I just wanted to lay that out to say we are essentially, in international criminal law years, we are essentially sprinting an entire marathon. But we have a number of advantages with respect to the Ecocide campaign that the crime of aggression didn't have. So for example, we have the advantage of a global grassroots movement. We have the advantage of a growing international awareness and connection with the environment and environmental issues. We have the advantage of a number of well-established national and civil society organizations advocating for environmental issues and have been for a long time. So there's significant global expertise on environmental issues at the grassroots local level and at the government level that didn't exist with respect to the crime of aggression. We have 19 national branches and associate groups actively working with governments to support ecocide, and the crime of aggression did not have that. We have multi-sector engagement, and also the crime of aggression didn't have that. Lastly, multilateralism right now is in need of a good story, and ecocide could be just that story. Let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Aisha. Okay, what's needed to have ecocide included? As I've mentioned, a 2/3 majority to have the crime adopted. As a states party, the New Zealand government will have a voice and a vote. Internally, MFAT, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, is the responsible ministry, and we've we've been engaging with MFAT. Ultimately, of course, it requires cabinet approval to support the introduction of the crime of ecocide within the Rome Statute. There is progress towards reaching the stage of ecocide being proposed by a state or states for study, for debate, and for consideration by ICC states parties. And we'll take a look in the next slide at some of that activity. So in 2019, Vanuatu and the Maldives asked for serious consideration by the ASP of the crime of ecocide. The following year, they were joined by Belgium and Finland. And last year, Samoa, Vanuatu, Belgium, and Bangladesh included support for ecocide in their official statements and co-sponsored a side event with the Stop Ecocide campaign. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so currently activities supportive of ecocide amongst parliamentary decision makers have taken place in 17 states parties of the ICC, in Latin America, in Asia Pacific, and in WEOG, and by WEOG I mean mostly the European members. This has included parliamentary motions, multi-party proposals, Foreign Affairs Committee recommendations, passing resolutions, etc. Several governments have already shown a positive interest in the campaign, and I think particularly after the legal definition was publicly launched. The UK government is currently considering amendments to the Environment Bill to include ecocide as an international crime. The governments of Chile and Bangladesh are considering amendments to their domestic legal frameworks, including changes to their criminal codes or constitutional changes incorporating ecocide. Several legal, environmental, and foreign affairs committees within the European Union have urged the EU to support ecocide as an international crime within the jurisdiction of the ICC. Now, the EU represents probably 30 plus members of the International Criminal Court of States Parties. And an EU report just out in the last week or so, it again urges the EU states to support the criminalisation of ecocide at the court. Individual politicians in Ireland and Mexico have urged their governments to support the recognition of ecocide at the ICC. Parties in the Swedish Parliament have forwarded motions in support of the criminalisation of ecocide. The Belgian government has voted to support this and to include ecocide within its domestic laws. Spain is also examining national legislation regarding the crime of ecocide, and Vanuatu and the Maldives, amongst others, are being persistently supportive of this and raising it before the ICC for its consideration. So there is a lot of activity happening both at the national level amongst civil society, but also amongst states parties, and particularly during the assembly of states parties. We could go to the next slide, thanks. I just put up a number of flags. It's of course no surprise that some of the key leaders on this, Vanuatu, Samoa, are small island states who are certainly experiencing the impact of climate change and the ecological crisis. The last three flags there, the European Union, as I mentioned, it's not a states party. I just put it there because it represents so many of its members are also members of the ICC. Scotland has passed a parliamentary motion urging the UK to recognise ecocide, and the last flag there is of West Papua, which included criminalising ecocide in its Green Agenda Plan released at the last COP26. And let's go to the very final one. This is basically a summary of the Stop Ecocide activities at COP26. We were in touch with James Shaw's office before he left for before he left for COP26. We're engaging obviously with his office as a follow-up, but you can see how active the campaign was at this event.
The International Criminal Court is talking about high-level things. We're comparing it with genocide, so it's bringing that sort of, well, I suppose, heinous acts of ecologically heinous acts would be one way of putting it. At that scale. So I wonder if we've got, it's 5 to 6. We thought we'd have a break, answer a few questions, and then come back with a few more, a bit more of a presentation, and then have a general talk about the issue about ecocide. And I hope what people can do as part of getting New Zealand engaged at a government level on ecocide. So there was a few questions I noticed in the chat, as well as those that are in the question and answers. So maybe what we should do is just do the questions in the chat, sorry, in the question and answers first, if that's okay, right, Lyndon and Brigid?
Mm-hmm.
You happy to do that? Claire's asking the question, can you clarify how the use of toxic substances that have been legalized could fit in the legal definition unlawful acts? Please explain. Yeah, I think the question is what at a global scale we've got to think about these things as well, and how it would fit in those areas. And I can't think of there's probably some maybe spraying Agent Orange of Vietnam might be a good example of ecocide in the past as a way of considering it, but others may not be. Anyway, Lyndon and Brigid, I don't know quite who would like to answer, or
well, I can say a few words initially. Can you hear me? I'm not sure whether.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, look, yes, it's a very good question. Obviously, specific examples weren't listed in the definition, so it's going to be up to, states, parties, and prosecutors to determine what are, or from civil society, as Brigid mentioned, to provide information to the prosecutor. The key thing, though, is it's unlawful or wanton. So they're separated. It's not unlawful and wanton. It's one. It can be one, or it can be the other. So if it's deemed that the use of a particular pesticide is a wanton act, and there is convincing evidence that is the case, even if it's considered legal in the nation that's using it, then it could potentially become a case. It could be brought to the prosecutor. So I think that's my understanding of the situation. Brigid, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think that's right. That's right, Lyndon. And also the use of these substances, this is where the proportionality test might come into play. So the benefits of it versus the impact on the environment and ecosystems and species, and whether there's a justifiable or whether it's having an excessive and disproportionate impact. But there's a lot of issues here that will be left up to a prosecutor to run a trial, and up to the judges to interpret and determine what is and isn't ecocide. They will really only take the most serious cases, and probably for the start, the most clear-cut cases to begin with. So we're starting to clarify what it is that we as an international community and the ICC mean by ecocide. But of course, it's the benefit then of an international law being ratified domestically, and the possibility of domestic prosecutions for these kinds of crimes that otherwise may not be taken up by the ICC.
What's your, Brigid, you've observed the ICC in the past, so what's your experience? Are they basically building a, I suppose, law, or sort of case law, or is it, I'm not quite sure how you describe it, and building up a set that can be used both internationally and domestically, or in regional agreements as well? Yes,
exactly that. So they are developing its own jurisprudence, which is benefiting from the work of the ad hoc tribunals, the tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the tribunal for Rwanda, and elsewhere, the Special Court for Sierra Leone and other international courts. And it's also, so it's expanding that jurisprudence. It's continuing to clarify its interpretations of the Rome Statute. That's not always consistent from case to case or from bench to bench. This will be a whole different kind of crime for the court to consider, because it will be considering harm that is beyond the harm experienced by humans. And that's going to be, I think, quite challenging for the court to be able to conceive of and quantify and consider and conceptualize and capture the kind of harm that we're talking about when we're discussing ecocide. And this is where I think Indigenous worldviews and the kind of work that's already being done by environmentalists around the world will be very helpful in capturing the harm done to ecosystems and species and the more than human forms of life. international criminal law has really been preoccupied with humans for an awful long time.
Just following up, sorry, is there a, like the criminal court, I assume like most of those courts are appointed, there's a political process by which, there's a selection of judges, of eminent judges are appointed. And I'm sort of assuming that if the crime of ecocide's agreed, then they'll want some expertise in environmental law, or as well as the sort of expertise in genocide and other sort of crimes.
Yes, that's right. So judges are elected by states parties, by the Assembly of States Parties, to the bench of the ACC for a period of 9 years. The prosecutor is also elected by states parties, again for a period of 9 years. They have just elected a new prosecutor. Karim Khan is now the new prosecutor, and they've also just elected 2 new deputy prosecutors, one of whom, Nazhat Shamin Khan, is a former ambassador for Fiji, but fortunately for the crime of ecocide, she was the president of COP23, I think, when Fiji held the presidency of the COP that year. So she has experience and exposure and, a significant level of expertise on these issues. And we're so fortunate to have had her elected as a deputy prosecutor within the ICC. But for the court to really be able to investigate and prosecute this, there will need to be a kind of a whole new cadre of investigators and analysts and prosecutors brought into the court who have been trained in or are experienced in environmental law, and who could be trained in how to apply and use the crime of ecocide. It isn't going to be a natural fit probably for the current kind of expertise that the ICC has been developing over the last 20 years.
Thanks. Cath, we got some other questions. You want to, following in the chat.
Yes, indeed. And thanks for the questions, and thanks all of you who've joined us, because I know that there's another important environmental event on at the same time. Now, Claire has raised this question of the whether authorized legal activities are nevertheless ecocide, and we've heard some response about that. Agnes Granada has said, asked for a clarification, then said, no, I now understand it, but I think given the question has arisen, we should actually listen to it, which was, she asked about the difference of unlawful or wanton acts versus unlawful and wanton acts. And Jeffrey Foley added, oh, can wanton prevail over lawful? Well, we've had part of the answer to that, but can you explain the or and question, or answer that, or is that a technical legal thing that we should turn to others for?
Well, I'm sure that the legal brains that crafted the draft definition, and it is a draft, so it's almost certain not to continue on exactly as it is now, but I'm sure that the legal brains that drafted this agonized over whether to have and or, and I think they figured that or gave more opportunities. If you had to be, because and ties the two together, so it would have to be unlawful and wanton, whereas that having it as an or means it might be lawful, but it could still be wanton. So in respect of pesticides, it's an incredibly complex issue. My own view, and this certainly is my view and not the view of the Stop Ecocide people, but my own view is that the use of neonicotinoids, for instance, could well be considered a wanton act given the evidence of its deleterious effects on insects and particularly on our pollinators. So even though it's a lawful application at this point, at some stage, and as Brigid pointed out, we're a long way from getting this over the line, but at some stage you would hope that that sense prevails, and it's the science of the demonstration that, for instance, neonicotinoids, and there's a range of pesticides that are effectively our main weapons in our war on nature. So that's my take on it. Brigid, would you like to?
Oh, that's a great explanation. Yeah.
Okay, another question is from Brian Wielden, and having seen Brigid's slide that had the 20-year process for getting acts of aggression adopted as a crime, Brian says, what time frame are you working to, please? Essential work indeed, but recall David King has said that what we do in the next 3 to 4 years, in which time humanity will decide the climate and environment for the next 1,000 years. Code red, Antonio Guterres. So, I mean, we know that campaigning for these things takes a long time, but how do we possibly do that rapid move forward?
Well, I think that's everything that the campaign is doing right now. And we've certainly seen an uptick in attention and focus by states parties since the draft definition has been launched. There's now something concrete for them to be discussing and debating. I think we're hoping for a big leap forward at the next Assembly of States Parties at the end of this year, in which there would be a state or a coalition of states ready to make a formal request for the Assembly to begin study, debate, negotiations to develop a crime of ecocide. That there is already a draft is already a big step forward. I think we're kind of all thinking 3 to 5 years. 3 feels too short, but it feels like that's as quickly as we need to get it done. 5 is still in a tremendous sprint in international criminal law years, but perhaps it's possible. I think everyone is understanding the urgency of this, and the more we can do, and the more quickly we can do it is really everyone's goal. So, you know, the national campaigns, the extending of the mobilization of supporters, the kind of work it's been doing, both publicly and behind the scenes, is really trying to move with significant urgency. We don't have 20 years, that's clear. But as I said, we have a lot of advantages with this campaign that the crime of aggression did not have.
Yeah. I guess one of the things that occurs to me, just in the New Zealand context, is that we're in the process of looking at the revision of the resource management system. And having just been reading the papers, I'm feeling not entirely encouraged about this. And one of the points we've been making to the Ministry for the Environment, bearing in mind that the whole ministerial committee is actually chaired by the Minister of Finance, one of the things we've raised is, hey, you know, where's the reference to international obligations relating to the environment, which there's a similar one in the Fisheries Act, which does say that. And frankly, the officials just look flummoxed when we raised it. But given that they are consulting and as an afterthought have included environmental NGOs in a sort of information session today with submissions due on the 28th of November, 28th of February, maybe many of us on this call could actually make a submission on their sort of draft semi-formed stuff, because the next time we're going to see it is only when it turns up as a piece of draft law, as a bill, which will be in the 3rd quarter of this year, if they can make that. So I think we need to seize what opportunities we can, but it also seems to me that it would be great to have some of those tangata whenua folks that you were referring to and that I know have got some interest in this, as well as various others, to actually come in on this discussion and see what they would like to see in there. So somebody has asked, so when could this ecocide law actually come into play? I think you've actually answered that. There's some questions in the chat, despite my frequent attempts to get people to put them in the Q&A. Well, Claire Bleakley, who actually is co-chair of ECO, asked, does a crime have to have happened, or can a challenge be made before these substances are made legal? And I mean, for that matter, we might think they're not necessarily substances. They may be, for instance, fishing methods like bottom trawling, which destroys pretty much everything they go over. So can you address Claire's question there?
In the first instance, there would need to be a case taken of something that has already occurred after the crime is activated and is part of international law. And it needs to have occurred after that moment of activation. It can't apply retrospectively. In order for there to be a prosecution and perhaps we hope a conviction, in order for this law to probably have a more serious deterrent effect, in which case others might think twice before proceeding with deep sea trawling in the future. So the deterrent effect may happen simply by virtue of it being an international law of ecocide. We are sort of understanding that the potential perpetrators of possible ecocide crimes are perhaps a different set of people than have normally been associated with war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. For example, this would really scoop up and include the private sector.
Yeah.
And so that makes the profile of potential perpetrators quite different. And the fact that there is an international law standing alongside genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression may be enough of a deterrent. Some businesses may not want to risk this or get anywhere near crossing a line that could be considered an international crime. Others may take and only be diverted if there are prosecutions and successful prosecutions. So I think it'll be a mixture of perhaps those feeling deterred simply by the crime existing or the law existing, and others who will need proof of the teeth of the ICC to actually bring successful prosecutions. And once the judges start to interpret what an ecocide act and crime looks like.
Yeah, I would suspect it'd be a developing field of jurisprudence, both internationally, but also nationally. When if it became a internationally recognised crime, then I'm sure there'd be some broader litigation within Europe and elsewhere to bring that crime into domestic interpretations.
No, we've got another question here.
So we, Cath, I wonder whether we should go to finish the rest of the presentations, and then we could do the next set of questions. I think that's probably the best to do, and then we can get move the discussion on.
Right. Well, we're back into it. So the draft definition deliberately avoids examples. We've covered that before, and Brigid pointed out the reasons why. So I won't really dwell on this too much, but there's a lot of background information available on the website, and I welcome you all to, if and when you have time, to actually have a browse there. There's an incredible amount of the backgrounding. There's a commentary on the way that the definition was crafted. There's a lot of information there. So please do have a look at that when you have time. Next one, please, Aisha. So I'm going to, sorry, go back one. I'm going to stick my neck out and throw a few in here that could well be considered as crimes. Bearing in mind that nothing has yet been brought, but these are the kinds of things that could be considered in the marine realm, and some are obviously more clear-cut than others. So some things would be harder to actually pin on some particular person or a leader of a government or a head of a company. But some of the list, for instance, could be destructive fisheries, some inappropriate destructive mining, plastics, ocean dead zones, and then, in getting even broader in terms of the widespread part of the definition, things like ocean acidification, ocean heating and oxygen loss. Obviously, certain things will have real challenges in terms of attribution, although I don't think that should discourage us. It's just, it just has to be well thought through. Thanks, Aisha. Yeah, so just very quickly. So, you know, industrial fishing, just to jump back one, Aisha, industrial fishing, obviously, it's a legal activity, but in some cases, I should say, laws are broken. We know that from our own experience here. And as Cath mentioned, deep sea bottom trawling is a dreadful practice, and yet it is still legal, but it is causing drastic damage. So there are a number of destructive fishing techniques that I think could well fall into the definition of ecocide. Thanks, Aisha. Here in New Zealand, we've got, you know, we have a real issue with bottom trawling. And, you know, we have got some of our seamounts that are in our EEZ are protected, but others aren't. And the high seas is more or less a free-for-all at the present time. So this is something that really needs to be addressed, and there are there's a lot of attention being brought to this as we speak, but we'll continue on a little bit further. I mean, Greenpeace has got a big campaign on this at the moment, as does the High Seas Alliance. There's a number of, yep. Thank you. So the high seas and the seabed, this was a question that was raised early on in the ecocide, in the development of the ecocide draft. And if you think back to the definition, it takes us right out into outer space in terms of the environment, and it does include the high seas and seabed. So this is really an emblematic challenge of our times. The marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, it includes 2/3 of the world's ocean. At the moment, it's managed by a patchwork of bodies that regulate variously fishing, mining, shipping for specific areas. There is, as many of you will know, a global ocean treaty that's trying to be negotiated at the moment. You know, the best hope really is that we will get a creation of a set of ocean sanctuaries down the track a little way that will be off limits to industrial exploration or exploitation, and that would include deep sea mining. So that mining in the deep sea is governed at present time by another body set up under the UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. They're called the International Seabed Authority. So what role they play in the decisions ahead of us, I'm not clear. And I think hopefully Barry may be able to, Barry and Cath may be able to explain a little bit more on that. So already in the deep sea, we have 31 exploration permits that have been issued by the ISA. So the deep sea is the latest frontier in our extractivist civilization, and you'll see in the next slide just how much of the deep sea has already been allocated for exploration. So on the left, the left part of the slide shows the areas that are targeted. There's a lot of information on this slide, and you're welcome to browse it at your leisure later, and you're also welcome to go to the website of the ISA and have a close look at it if you so desire. But the main issue here is that there are 31 permits already issued for exploration. There was meant to already be mining permits put in place as well. The first mining permit was due in 2020. That's been delayed. However, there is clearly a major push by a fair number of nations to get their hands on the deep seabed. How that intersects and interacts and affects this global oceans treaty remains to be seen, but there are competing interests at play here, including the International Seabed Authority themselves, who have set up a company called the Enterprise, and they intend to mine the deep sea on behalf of some of the nations that can't afford to do so. However, as is the case with many of these situations, the treaty, the law of the sea, the part of it that set up the ISA, actually includes all of the right words and clauses in regard to the precautionary principle, maintaining ecological integrity, ecosystem, protecting ecosystems. So again, we have conflicting interests and a significant challenge, I think, in reining this in. Next slide, please, Aisha. Plastic pollution, I think some of the questions were regarding that. And again, there is a major meeting coming up to try to address plastic pollution. We know that New Zealand is one of the worst. We create too much plastic, or we use too much plastic by far. There is a resolution that's been put forward by Rwanda and Peru that proposes a legally binding agreement which addresses the full life cycles of plastics. This going right back from the extraction of the fossil fuels to the production, manufacture and consumption, and including the end-of-life management and retrieval. There is another resolution that's been put forward by Japan that is much, much weaker. So again, it's a kind of a matter of watch this space. This is being negotiated pretty much as we speak in the next month or so. So plastics and pesticides are not going away. In fact, we are creating globally more and more, and it's estimated that within the next couple of decades, we'll be producing 3 times as many as we currently produce. And you can see from the graph on the left that the production is just going almost exponentially at present. A number of the carbon majors invested, I think it was $40 billion a decade or so ago in new plants to make more plastic. So the graph there doesn't just include plastics, it includes pesticides, and it includes, well, the overarching term is novel entities. And in all cases, as you can see, the graphs look like our CO2 curve. If anything, they're all heading in the wrong direction and rising rapidly. So it's another major challenge that we face. Let's hope that this latest round of negotiations actually gets us somewhere. But this paper came out just a couple of weeks ago, and the links are there. The links are for all of the information on these slides are on the slides themselves, so you'll be able to track back as you wish. But their conclusion was that the rapid growth is outstripping society's ability to assess, let alone manage. And we know from the news reports that places in the Central Pacific that are uninhabited for thousands of kilometers in any direction are covered in plastics. In fact, if you walk on any beach anywhere, I guarantee you will find plastics. So we have a significant problem here, and I think this is one thing that potentially the ecocide law could help with. Thanks, Aisha. So yeah, the following slide just highlights that we have another treaty potentially being negotiated right now. And that was that's yet to be just determined, but it's a massive amount of plastics that are pouring into the oceans, let alone everywhere else every year. So we have a major challenge on our hands here. Thanks, Aisha. So getting even more widespread and broad scale, we're facing significant changes to our global ecosystems. So this is just a prediction of the changes in ocean aragonite saturation, which is aragonite is the form of limestone that most sea creatures use to build their skeletons. And once it drops below 3, which is the yellow color there, more and more animals and plants, for that matter, because some plants use it as well, will struggle to actually build their skeletons. So here are the predictions under one of the modeling scenarios that basically at the present time, when CO2 was at 280 parts per million, most of the oceans were in very good shape in terms of aragonite saturation, and our reefs and our deep water corals and our kelp beds and everything else was functioning quite satisfactorily. As it's moved forward, less and less of the oceans remain in a saturated state. And at 800 parts per million, well, even at 450, which is not far off, large sections of the oceans become undersaturated in aragonite, and that is a drastic impact on ocean biodiversity and everything that depends upon that. Thanks, Aisha. There was a very nice study done here looking at one deep water coral and its distribution range. And this is, again, it's modeling, but I think it's a really powerful set of slides to illustrate one of the issues that we're facing on the global scale. And we know the cause very well. It's carbon dioxide dissolving into the oceans. So you can see on the left-hand side of this graph, the colors correspond with the suitability of habitat. Red means it's a really suitable habitat. Yellow means it's a good habitat, and blue means it's less suitable. And so you can see at the present time that this particular species, Solomosimilia variabilis, has got quite a wide distribution range around New Zealand on the Chatham Rise, across the subantarctic, and up towards out onto the Lord Howe Rise. By 2100, if CO2 concentrations continue to increase in the oceans, the aragonite saturation state will be such that this species will be far more limited in terms of its distribution range. And one of the highlights of this study, it was pointing out that seamounts could well represent an important future refugia. So why are we bottom trawling on them? You know, there are cross-cutting issues here that the synergistic effects of which I think really are crucial for taking this forward. Thanks, Aisha. Ocean heating. I mean, this is the biggest of the lot of them, really. And you know, this is not modeling. This is basically satellite snapshots of the heat that the oceans has been absorbing since 1980. And you know, 1980, the oceans were already warm. So 1980 is not really a true baseline. It's a shifted baseline from 1880. But you can see that, and these are look at just running across the top set of images, the annuals. You can see how much heat we're putting into the oceans. The effects of that are drastic. I know this well from my own work on coral reefs, which could well be functionally extinct within 30 years if we continue to do what we're doing. And that's not to detract from the amazing adaptability of corals. So, you know, but nevertheless, the synergistic impacts of heating and acidification as time goes on could well see the end of a whole ecosystem. So I think that, if anything, is ecocide. Surely that is. But are we going to be able in a court to actually attribute this to any particular players? That to me would be a major challenge. But these are the kinds of issues that we face as a global civilization at this point in our history. Thanks, Aisha. So air pollution, these are just some other examples. You know, I'm a marine person, so I'm very focused on the oceans, but you know, obviously industrial emissions are causing, you know, droughts, floods, wildfires, again impacting ecosystems and threatened species on land just as much as they're doing in the sea. And it comes back to all of us. You know, we're all responsible, but there are some of us who are more responsible than others. Thank you, Aisha. Oil spills, you know, these are obviously much more easily attributable, pardon me. So, you know, this year alone, we've already had 4 significant oil spills in, you know, and it almost goes without comment these days. But the impact of these and the big ones like the Deepwater Horizon, you know, the slick extended for nearly 150,000 square kilometres. You know, it's got decadal levels of impact on biodiversity, let alone the people that live there. So these I think would be far more attributable, and you know, these are also already often punishable under national law. So you know, the BP I think ended up paying out billions in terms of compensation for what happened in the Deepwater Horizon. But again, if and when ecocide becomes a crime, then it would well be could well be a significant deterrent to these kinds of things to occur, because there was a significant amount of negligence involved in that particular case. Thanks, Aisha. This is getting back to Claire's question, and you know, for sure, some applications of pesticides and fertilizers, for that matter, could be considered ecocidal. It's a matter of scale and you know, the level of damage. So as Brigid pointed out, each case would need to be judged on their merits in respect of the criteria that are established in the definition. But you know, these are the kinds of things, and you know, where we're using pesticides or where people are applying pesticides like neonicotinoids that are basically undermining our capacity to grow food, I think there's a case could be made. My own view. Thank you, Aisha. Deforestation. Again, this is a fairly clear-cut example in places where it certainly shouldn't be happening at this stage in our time on Earth. You know, there's a bit of recent work done when places like the Amazon are stable and they're accumulating diversity through time. The ancient trees delay the extinction process, particularly of rare species. They may live long enough for the climate or the environment to once again allow genetically rich trees to share their bounty with the rest of the forest.
Can I just intervene here, please, Lyndon? We've got a lot of questions, and rather than going through lots more examples, I think we need to kind of wrap up the presentation and then let people have their questions heard and answered, if you don't mind. I don't know quite how much more presentation you two have got, but to be fair to the people who've joined, I think
there's about 6 slides left.
Yeah, I think I can finish in about 5 minutes if that was our intention, Cath.
Yeah.
Okay, fine, thanks.
So yeah, I mean, if I could just continue, there's a number of things. Look, we'll just move through these quite quickly now, Aisha. Just people can look at it as they wish later. Deforestation is another one, obviously. Illegal mining is another one. Yep, keep moving, Aisha. Yep. So the Amazon is a classic case in point. Here, there's been some research done, and you're welcome to read the thesis. It's online. It was a case study that was done as a master's thesis back in 2012, I think initiated after Polly Higgins visited and started the conversation here. Yep, you can have a look at that. The woman who did the work considered that there were cases that could potentially be brought, and that was based on a very early definition. Yeah, thanks, Aisha. There's a complementary approach. Brigid mentioned it earlier, and Mike Smith of the Iwi Leaders Council. So I won't stress this at this point because Brigid did raise this earlier in our presentation. So we'll keep going, Aisha. And the Earth Laws approach, I won't dwell on this either, other than to note that Ecuador's High Court has affirmed constitutional protections for the rights of nature in a landmark decision recently. And obviously here in New Zealand, the Wanganui River has received recognition as a living entity. So we're making some progress. Our plans, as you know, we want to keep raising awareness and appreciate the opportunity that we've had today to talk with you. We're going to follow up with the relevant New Zealand government ministries. So next slide. Thank you, Aisha. In New Zealand, already we have 280 people signed up as Earth Protectors, which is one way that you can support the campaign. Most of this is done voluntarily, and the foundation internationally runs on donations. So, you know, if you feel the inclination to give some support, please feel free. But you can see from this slide that there are a lot of people across New Zealand that are already well aware of this and wanted to go forward. And I think that's it. So, Cath, over to you. Let's have some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Lyndon, and thanks, Brigid, for an excellent presentation about the issues about ecocide and also some of the potential examples of ecocide and the way things are forward. Can we put that at some stage we should put that second to last slide up again so people know where the contact details are.
And also to just respond to Agnes, who's asked about getting copies of the presentations. As I understand it, Brigid and Lyndon, you're willing to share those and that Eco will be able to post them. Aisha will do that after this, and hopefully also the questions and comments, which I always think are important elements of this sort of discussion. Can we go back to the question that, and Barry, could you mute, please? The question that Kathy Voiles raised, and we'll have to keep the answers short and sweet, which is the question about whether small groups or any kind of civil society can take cases or raise cases in the Environment Court. And I guess from there, or anywhere else for that matter, from there, whether we, or whether it would only be governments. And I think what we're looking at then is also, you know, who can take these things to the court? Does it have to be a government? And you went through that process of getting, I think, a majority of governments. I can't remember the actual percentage majority who'd have to agree to any particular case. Do you want to comment on that, either of you?
Yeah, I'm happy to start on that if it's okay. No, you don't need any states parties involved in deciding on whether a case or an investigation goes forward. The states parties are required to adopt a international crime of ecocide. So we require all parties to be involved, but 2/3 majority, so 82 states to agree to and adopt an international definition defining ecocide, and for that to become activated within the jurisdiction of the ICC. Cases investigations are opened at the selection of the Office of the Prosecutor. So once you're into a legal process, yes, the court is surrounded by global politics and a lot of political pressures, but there is a part of the court that really needs to function as an independent judicial process. So the selection of cases, the opening or not of investigations will be at the discretion of the Office of the Prosecutor, as well as with the approval of judges. So those become the key actors there. As I mentioned earlier, there are 3 triggers to bring issues to the court. One is a referral by a state's party. One is a referral by the UN Security Council. And the third is the prosecutor opening investigations himself. NGO, civil society, governments, international actors, networks can provide and submit dossiers to the Office of the Prosecutor, urging them to investigate issues we believe are potential crimes of ecocide. That will then go through the legal process of being under a preliminary examination. Are these even potential crimes that fall within the jurisdiction of the court? Did they occur after the crime had come into play, had been activated? Are they on a territory of a state's party or potentially committed by a national of a state's party? So there's a number of considerations to get through, but that's all part of the judicial process, but anyone can submit a dossier.
That's really interesting. I can feel people just starting to get their dossiers together right now, except that, of course, it's not a crime with the ICC yet. Now, Brian Weldon has gone and had to leave and said thank you, but he did also make a comment, and I'm not asking you to respond to this really, but says, you know, all this is fine, but actually we'll need a revolution. And Extinction Rebellion is trying to do that. And particularly going after corporations and banks. So, I mean, I think all of us in this know that probably we need a whole range of mechanisms and activities, some of them not necessarily strictly legal, to deal with getting people to look after the environment. So I won't dwell on that. But going to Gwen Bray, she makes the comment that actually chucking lots of satellites up into Earth's atmosphere, or the biosphere, she puts it, with no restrictions, that could be ecocide. But of course, again, there's that thing of it not being retrospective. But on the basis that so little is known of these irreversible activities, and that, I guess, takes us into the question of the implementation of the precautionary principle
Cath, is also
in favour of the environment.
Cath, is also the fundamental issue about what's in scope, and I suppose I don't know whether that's I don't know sure if Lyndon or Brigid passed through that as to what part of the, is it the whole biosphere? Is it just things that are, you know, within the stratosphere, or is it more than that?
Yes, it is more than that. The definition includes the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the atmosphere, and outer space. So and as Brigid mentioned, the drafters, I think, agonized long and hard about whether to actually leave the environment as an open book or whether to actually start specifying. And in this case, they decided to actually specify pretty much everything that is here on Earth and in our neighborhood in space. And indeed, there's somebody else, well, some other folks in the Earth Laws group who are looking at the rights of the moon as well. So I don't think we should imagine that it will just stay contained. Moving quickly along so we can get through some of these questions. There's one from Colleen Phillip, who is actually an eco-exec member as well as belonging to other groups, but she notes that she's intrigued by the fact that Russia and the ex-Soviet Union states moved forward with national legislation, but don't seem to be early adopters for international law. And of course, given where Mr. Putin is at, one might wonder about where he stands on the issue of aggression. However, would you like to comment on what it is that makes countries early adopters as opposed to laggards or non-adopters?
I think I don't know when Russia and the other former states of the former Soviet Union adopted their laws on ecocide. I suspect they may have been some decades ago. I don't think it's related to this campaign. They obviously had their own political movement or pressures, or perhaps their own experiences, Chernobyl, for example, that may have heightened and piqued their particular response and sensitivity to these issues. I don't think it's in response to this global campaign since 2017. I believe they existed prior to that. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting, but it's a good question that some future thesis could address, I think.
Yes, yes, wonderful. And just one other thing, Cath, just to say that Extinction Rebellion is a supporter of the Stop Ecocide campaign. So right. They are a collaborating part of the collaborating network around this global campaign.
Yeah, and I think we all know that we all have to do everything we can, not just one thing. Mm-hmm. Now, Marilyn asks a question, which is, or puts an issue forward, I guess. When there are multiple pollution and damage sources, how can any one organisation or government be charged? Well, I think I know the answer to that, which is that you select somebody and maybe more than one person. But what's the authoritative answer from you two?
Do you want me to answer that? So yes, the ICC will select cases. It has quite transparent criteria. in terms of its own policy work, but the Rome Statute also requires it to consider a number of things. I mentioned some of them earlier. Have the crimes or acts occurred within the time the crimes was activated as an international crime? Is it on the territory of a state's party or potentially committed by a national of a state's party? Does it meet the interests of justice? Is it gravity enough? Does it meet the threshold of gravity? So there are a number of things to consider in making the selection. Financial resources is one of the things in terms of the selection of the number of cases overall. And yes, in some situations where the court has been working, it has prosecuted more than one person within those situations. And then, you know, is developing its ability to close situations so it has the resources, personnel and financial to move on to other investigations and situations. So it can be more than one. You might, you know, you could get potentially 2 or 3 in a corporation if that's what we're thinking. It will be up to the prosecutor to determine who they think is most responsible and where they have the strongest case. Something Lyndon said earlier I want to pick up on, which is the issue of liability. So proving this actor, this corporation committed this and it had this effect, or the substantial likelihood of having this effect. And that's why the way it's been crafted as an act of endangerment is very clever and very smart. The harm doesn't need to have played out and materialized if the substantial likelihood to cause harm exists and can be proven. And then it will be a process of in-depth forensic investigations by the Office of the Prosecutor to establish who is most liable for this. So the liability question then will emerge out of the case theory and out of the investigations. Who's most responsible, who's most senior?
One question I had from that was, you know, in prosecuting individuals, for example, genocide or crimes against humanity, it's clear who they are. The criminal court can put people in, you know, has ability to put people in jail for long times because parties have allowed their jails or whatever to be used. But does anyone thought about the sort of what the prosecution endpoint would be? You know, for example, if you prosecuted the main parties behind, say, the Bhopal disaster, what would they be imprisoned, or is there ability to you know, millions of dollars in compensation? I'm just musing as to what might be the compliance.
Yes, someone
issues.
else asked that in the questions actually, and I tried to answer that as we were going. So yes, if a person is convicted before the ICC, there is jail time. They are sentenced. Some have been sentenced to 12 years, 15 years, 20 plus years. I mean, they're serving time. They are a convicted international criminal. And there will also be a reparations decision, which means there will be a financial reparations. It might be also rehabilitative reparations, and it might also include symbolic reparations. And all of those have been considered in the decisions where the judges have issued court-ordered reparations in some of the other cases. So yes, convictions will mean serving time and reparations.
Useful to know, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. And actually there was a question about that, which I seem to have somehow lost, or maybe it's buried in the chat or something. But Eugenie Sage has a question, which is, how many major cases does the International Criminal Court deal with each year? And if the Rome Statute is amended to make ecocide a crime, what is the likely ICC caseload given the many issues which deserve investigation and prosecution? And presumably there's issues of political will and judicial capacity and money, and no doubt some people might provide money. I don't know. Tell us.
Yeah, well,
the question.
Yes, all of them have been great questions, as is this one, Eugenie. Thank you very much. All of the states parties contribute to the budget of the International Criminal Court, including New Zealand. We contribute to the annual budget of the ICC. And based on that budget and the specific budget to the Office of the Prosecutor, they are able to determine the cases, the investigations they are able to conduct that year. They, of course, spend a long time preparing their budget bid and making their case for this funding from states parties in order to maximize their impact. It is an enormous global mandate, much bigger than really any one court can address. And that's why the national ratifications, national prosecutions, in future regional prosecutions by regional courts becomes increasingly important.
Okay.
I guess per year, it's hard to say, Eugenie, but a case before the ICC will take several years. It's a slow, long process. International justice does not move quickly. But a number of investigations can be launched and get underway simultaneously. The court is probably running right now a couple of cases, which means court time in cases before the judges. And ecocide will become a crime that it needs to consider against the others. But I think it's a crime for which there would be great interest in seeing investigations and prosecutions. I feel like
sorry, there's a related question, which is who is...
Sorry, Cath, we've got a minute left in terms of our time.
Yeah, I just wanted to put Jeffrey's question, because it's very closely involved, which is who is responsible for monitoring illegal ecocide activity? And are the governments of member countries obliged to monitor their own citizens and corporations? If we could have a real quick answer to that. Are
they obliged? Obliged, I mean, in theory, yes. In practice, that's probably not what happens without concern, voices, movements by civil society raising those issues to government. But yes, governments would have that obligation in theory to bring domestic prosecutions under an ecocide law once New Zealand has, in our case, once New Zealand has ratified it into our domestic law.
Okay,
I would say everyone.
Pressing question, which is there an iwi involved in this campaign? And I think you covered that, and the answer is yours to give very quickly.
Yes, we've reached out to iwi and to significant environmental activists amongst iwi and iwi leaders. We're still in that process of engaging and forming relationships and rapport. That's our intention going forward, of course, as well. That's a critical voice. And as I mentioned earlier, we're interested in exploring with iwi and Māori academics working on environmental issues and te tiriti issues, how ecocide relates and whether ecocide relates to te tiriti obligations, and whether this might not end up being another lever to advance te tiriti commitments within the environmental space.
Okay, thank you. And somebody wants to see a slide, but they're going to be mailed out, so we'll leave you to have a look at that, Sunny.
Yeah, and also, Cath, we'll be, so we've done this as a Facebook Live, and also we'll put it on YouTube. And so if so the slides will be available as the whole presentation will be available for people to watch again, or suggest to people who couldn't make the presentation to see it again. I particularly like to thank Lyndon and Brigid for an excellent presentation, really detailed. It's really helpful, and it's really interesting to know how it all fits together, and you also get a bit of sense about how the ICC, International Criminal Court, operates and how it all fits into the sort of global picture, because I think that's really important. We see sort of occasional court scenes on TV from away in The Hague or somewhere else in the regional courts. So it'll be really interesting to see how this process goes, and hopefully the New Zealand government will get behind adopting ecocide as a criminal in the International Criminal Court. So I really thank you. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure the audience really enjoyed the webinar. And we'll, as I said, we'll get details out to the participants and also others who couldn't join. I don't know if there's anything else, Aisha, do you want to say before I close?
No, I think you've covered it all, Barry. So we will be sending out a campaign soon with the presentation, a copy of the presentation, as well as a copy of the recording of this session, so everybody could share and use at their own convenience, and also stay updated on our social channels to hear about the upcoming webinars and events from ECO. So thank you.
And Aisha, just before we pull the plug, can you make sure that we have both the Q&A and the chat saved?
Yes.
So if people want to look at that and so on. And there's an idea brewing in my mind, which the Eco-Exec hasn't even talked about yet, but that is to actually do a webinar to do with the resource management law system reform.
Actually, that's
so
something.
many problems attached to it and some strengths. So we're wondering about whether to try and do something on that. Thank you both.
Thanks, Cath. I was going to say that we'll do a series of webinars. We did one last year talking with James Shaw, the Minister of Climate Change, after he came back from COP in Glasgow, and we're hoping this year to run a series of webinars, and including things like seabed mining, which Lyndon talked about earlier, was one of the issues that's being looked at. And certainly resource management seems like a good thing to do. So I'll just close. Kia tau, kia tatou katoa, te ao, te arahami, te maratau, te he mariora. And wish everyone well for the future. Ngā mihi nui ki pai te rā. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you too. Thanks so much to Eco for hosting this.
Kia rā.